Deputy Catherine Connolly TD
Gurmín Magad the Lascan Corla and Curran Falchi Rev on Jesh Conch Modulation Rune Show. Agus tá sé Jackar in áíre mar tá mé bantuk agus tá mé ceangailse leis an scéil seo go persanta agus go profisiúnta ach Jenny mé mo dhíhel. Minister, I welcome the opportunity to speak on this today, and I find it difficult actually on many levels because both professionally and personally I've had an involvement with this topic for many years. The recent image of the photograph of a 103-year-old woman going to meet her 81-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, meeting Eileen in Scotland, and Eileen had spent her time and was a resident in the Bethany home. Surely that image alone, Minister, might have prodded you to make a different speech today, and in no way do I mean to be personal. And I have the greatest of respect for you. And really all I can think of is that you've been taken captive by your department. And I find that difficult to understand, because the most important aspect in all of this is trust. And you inherited a terrible situation, and I appreciate that. And you're trying to deal with a very difficult situation. But trust is very important. And when a speech is made like that today, which at its, I would say, disingenuous in parts, and I use that word very reluctantly, but when you talk about no redress at this point because we must wait until the Commission completes, I really find it difficult to hide my frustration. The second interim report clearly identifies the need for the government to look at a redress scheme. It does not say that it has to wait till the end of the report. Paragraph 429. Accordingly, the Commission considers that the exclusion of the named mother and baby homes and so on needs to be re-examined. And it goes on to say, children who were resident in these institutions without their mothers would seem to have been in the same position as children resident in the institutions which were eligible for redress. And it goes on to appeal to the government, Minister, and you're the face of the government today, to look at a redress scheme because there was no justification for distinguishing between those who received compensation from the industrial schools and those children that were in mother and baby homes. They do make a distinction between those who are unaccompanied. I won't go into that distinction today, I don't accept it, but for the record, I wish your speechwriter, if you didn't write it, read the reports. I've read them all. I've taken the trouble of reading them all so that I'm briefed on the matter before I speak, and I cannot understand how you can stand here today and not agree at least with the first section of the motion, which is to have a redress scheme for those who spend time in mother and baby homes. The speech talks about no abuse has been identified. If you go back to the original redress scheme that I attended in a professional capacity, they had to show a medical report that they had suffered. It wasn't a question of liability or blame at that point, although certainly blame was attached separately from the Ryan report. And you know, the most appalling part of that is I still, at this age and in this, if I say what people got, I will become committing an offence and liable to a penalty or imprisonment, and also the person who received the award under that redress scheme if they disclose any information. That is the background that continued right into the 21st century. And here we are today, and we're appealing to a government to do the decent thing and the right thing and set up a redress scheme. And you're coming back with that nature of a speech which is simply unacceptable. I have repeatedly quoted the memos that were given to the government back in 2012 in relation to the Tuam and the Bessborough mother and baby homes. It was quite clear that there were volumes of information. What jumps out, and I'm going to come back to the fifth interim report if I have the time, with absence of information. Back in 2012, the draft briefing paper. Now, Minister, I've quoted this before, and I'm asking you today specifically, have you read those briefing papers? And have those briefing papers been brought to the attention of the Commission? They talk about a wealth of information in relation to Bessborough and a wealth of information in relation to Tuam. They talk about the records relating to Tuam are detailed and extensive and will require time to comb through. And they go on finally to talk about irregularities, areas of concern in relation to patient safety, but with relevance to this debate, possible interference with birth and death certification requiring further investigation. Now, my time is limited, but they're the briefing papers that was brought to the level of the government in 2012 through the Martin McAleese report into the Magdalen Laundry. And that report clarified that they couldn't investigate, but they wanted to make sure that it was investigated. It wasn't. And here we are today. That was 12. We're now 19. And we're still appealing for a basic redress scheme for those who spent time in mother and baby homes where they suffered the most appalling neglect, to put it mildly. I want to pay tribute to the social worker from those briefing notes who did a tremendous amount of work at the time in the west of Ireland. And very often I'm critical of social workers on our own time and in the evening to highlight the scandal. Now, I note you're nodding, Minister, but I wish perhaps that you might nod and say that you're going to withdraw your amendment. When we look at the 5th interim report, which I've read in detail, what jumps out is the more difficult question to answer is why the children were buried in such an inappropriate manner. That's specifically in relation to Tuam, 798 children. Why were they buried in such an inappropriate manner? And then it goes on to talk about whether they were actually used as sewage or not. That's the only slight divergence, whether they were used. And they would have seemed to have been used for a certain length of time for sewage. But that's the only little wriggle there in relation to it. They certainly weren't burial chambers. And then they go on to highlight the County Council and the failure to give information or cooperate, and the failure to comment on the draft report sent to them and so on. And that was the very County Council that was put in charge of the consultation process. Can you imagine that? This report, the interim report, is highlighting the inadequacy, I would put it mildly, of the County Council, and that's the very County Council that the government put in charge in relation to a consultation process. And I recall being in Tuam when you were there, Minister, and fair play to you for attending, and Simon Coveney, Minister at the time. And you talked about bringing closure, and I think you fundamentally missed the point. It's about bringing openness, not closure. And to stop the buried secrets. We haven't just got buried bodies in sewage chambers, we've got buried secrets. And unless we realise that and go forward, we're not going to learn. Many things jump off the 5th interim report, and in a sense they're not relevant today, but I couldn't let one or two of them go without mentioning them. The sale of infant bodies to the medical faculty in Galway at 10 shillings a body through the central hospital at the time. Some may have come from the mother and baby home. It jumps off the page at page 55. The other thing that jumps off the page are the affidavits. The affidavit in this case happens to be in relation to the Jesus and Mary, the Sacred Heart, the congregation, and their affidavit was speculative, inaccurate and misleading. So I sit here today and I listen to your speech, and then I listen to Fianna Fáil, and I have the greatest respect for the deputy who's in the chamber. But when that deputy on behalf of Fianna Fáil talks about waiting till the Commission does its work, I would think they haven't read the report and realised that the Commission clearly called on the government to consider a redress scheme. That's number one. Number two, these dark secrets are not in the past. They're very much in the present. And for as long as you're part of that government, then you're part of the secrets continuing to be covered up. And language being used about truth and love and honesty, while all of the time there is no uncovering of the terrible deeds that were done. Indeed, on the last occasion, and I think it's worth quoting again, Oliver St. John Gogarty, 91 years ago, when he said, "It is high time that the people of this country find some other way of loving God than by hating women." Now, I would say that things have dramatically changed for the good, the better in relation to women, but that underlying ideology where bad was attributed particularly to single mothers, and that's how society dealt with it. We have an obligation to take that burden off their shoulders. They did not deserve that guilt nor that burden. And it is our duty to apologise The government must apologise and then put a practical scheme in place for a redress scheme to give the most basic redress. In relation to the difficulties with a redress scheme, those were operational. The cost of the scheme is reflective of the involvement of the legal profession and many other aspects in relation to that, and primarily the failure to get the various congregations to pay what they should have paid. They are not arguments to prevent a redress scheme being set up now. We're talking about a limited number of people, and I'll finish with the image that I started with. The 104-year-old woman travelling to meet her 80-plus daughter for the first time after 6 decades of a search. Now just keep that image in mind and then say, can we stand here and not do our duty? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deputy Connolly.